Our group chose to look at John Hancock's Boston Massacre Oration, which was given in 1774 at an event commemorating the Boston Massacre in Massachusetts. And this was by Eliza Pichet, El Medina, Cassie Segura, Emily Bisson, and Biani Hernandez. So when I say the name John Hancock, most people tend to think of the biggest and most legible signature on the Declaration of Independence, and thus your signature is called your John Hancock, or sometimes referred to that. And this is kind of representative of who he was as a person. He was born in 1737 in Massachusetts and attended Harvard before inheriting his family's estate. And when the push for independence kind of came about after this speech was delivered in 1776, you could tell that he would be a prominent patriot and someone who really wanted American independence. This can be seen through his John Hancock because of how big he signed it on the Declaration, and it kind of shows how he really believed America should have its independence from Britain. He later became a prominent member of this kind of push for independence as he served as the president of the Second Continental Congress and became governor of Massachusetts. But even before this, around the time the speech was written, you could see that even though the idea for independence hadn't truly developed in the colonists yet, that he still really cared about having his rights and not having the kind of tyrannical force of Britain imposing on the colonists, which can be seen throughout this work. So for historical context for the Boston Massacre, which is the event that John Hancock was speaking about, we can really look at post-French and Indian War times, where even though Britain won the war, they were in a lot of debt, and they needed to tax the colonists. So they passed these important acts, the Sugar, Stamp, and Tea Act in 1764, 1765, and 1773, respectively. They all taxed common day items such as, obviously, sugar, molasses, paper items, and tea, but the colonists felt that this was an imposition into their rights because they had no say in this and were really unhappy about the fact that there were no representatives that got to have their voice heard in these situations. And the acts were passed without their consent, which led to the no taxation without representation motto that many people still quote to this day. And then this, on top of the fact that the colonists had to quarter these British troops in their home, led to the Boston Massacre, which was a skirmish in Boston where colonists were taunting the British soldiers, and then the British opened fire on them, and 4 of them were killed. And then the colonists, not just in Boston, but all across the colonies, were very, very upset about this because it really showed the intentions of the British and how not only were they imposing these taxes and forcing them to quarter these troops, but they were shooting the colonists. And so it was a really important moment that affected Americans. Now we come to specifically why these orations were given at this time, and they happened on the 4th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, when John Hancock, Joseph Warren, Benjamin Church, and other important people in the revolutionary cause put this together, not just as a commemoration for the colonists that were hurt and killed, but also kind of to say, hey, look what Britain did. Like, we should probably think about what we need to do. And many of them thought about forming the militia. And then the audience of this piece is really important to understand because Hancock crafted this oration around how his audience would respond to different rhetorical strategies so he could fully get his point across. So he uses religious and safety concerns a lot in the piece because he knows that his audience is really focused on their relationship with British and how they don't necessarily want to go into a huge all-out war, but they also don't want these acts that are imposed on them to be passed. They don't want to quarter troops, and they don't want another thing like the Boston Massacre. So he kind of has to work to convince these people to get a militia who are not necessarily in favor of standing troops because of the British that they have to quarter in their homes, And so his rhetorical techniques are really based around his audience. And then this picture in the corner is a map of Massachusetts at the time, which is where his audience was from. So for the rhetorical situation of the audience, this speech was given in Boston where the Boston Massacre took place. And we can tell that the people who he was speaking to were definitely affected by the Boston Massacre, either directly, if they knew the people, or indirectly because of what happened with the British. So because of this relationship, he could really use pathos and bring out memories and emotions when talking about the Boston Massacre, to really get them to achieve his purpose of convincing them to better defend themselves against Britain. And this was a really big rhetorical device of pathos that he used throughout his piece. So the main purpose for Hancock's speech was to push for the kind of first set of defense, not necessarily going into a full revolution yet, because it is important to remember that at this time, the colonists did not yet want revolution or independence. They just kind of wanted to go back to the days before salutary neglect. And it took about 2 years later, when Common Sense came out, for them to really want independence. So the kind of bigger picture purpose right now is really getting a militia, getting defense, and then also really working to get their voices heard, to get Britain to not impose these acts on them without their consent. And this picture is kind of what came to be of his militia idea. This is the Continental Army during the American Revolution. Even though this was, multiple years after this, his militia idea, along with Henry's militia idea and others, were kind of the cause for the Continental Army. So now we're going into kind of the key points for this speech, and we picked out quotes that were really important from this speech, that could be represented to summarize parts of it, the rhetoric that he used, and then similarities to other works that we've been learning about in class, that were also written around this time, but also kind of transitional times that we could see similarities in as well. So for the first part of his speech, he kind of starts out talking about how what he's doing and his idea is for the interest of his country, which is using ethos to explain kind of that even though his idea is kind of out there, it is for the betterment of America. He also refers to Britain and talks about how it is kind of horrible to support a government like Britain who doesn't care about its people, which is not only using pathos when saying these horrible things about Britain, and it is infamous and it is vicious to support this government, but also using kind of a bandwagon technique to be like, the only people who would support this are, treasonous and have no morals. And then this first technique of kind of using ethos to explain that their ideas are for the betterment of their country is something that Patrick Henry also did in his speech to the Virginia Convention, when he was talking about how, again, his idea of forming a militia, he's doing that because he's a patriot. Hancock next asked a series of rhetorical questions to his audience, kind of showing how Great Britain have or haven't really supported the colonists as much as they would think their mother country would. And then Henry does this again in his speech when he asks, are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? And he's doing this in response to a different argument. But both things are kind of getting at the point that Britain was imposing onto the colonists, and they shouldn't let that happen. So the next part of the oration, Hancock takes a really, really long time to recount what happened on the night of the Boston Massacre for his audience, and it's really heart-wrenching how he says it, and throughout the whole thing he's kind of talking about how the British are horrible and the colonists are more innocent or victim-like. He also does something where he makes it seem like this is the most important event to ever happen, when he says, may ever stand in history without parallel, which is a big statement. And he's using it to his audience because since they were directly affected by the Boston Massacre, to them that's how it feels, so he's appealing to that sense. By using the hyperboles to kind of make an event seem like super, super important. This is something Thomas Paine in Common Sense did when he wanted to get his audience to just kind of believe how important revolution was in America's history. Paine used the hyperboles to talk about how, this revolution, this moment right now, will forever be in history and will forever be carved into the oak tree, kind of because it is so important. So after giving this heart-wrenching tale about what happened and kind of pulling his audience to remember the horrors of the Boston Massacre, Hancock uses hyperboles to talk about how important it was. Then, after kind of summarizing everything that happened, he transitions to this rallying cry. First by talking about how we dread nothing but slavery. And this really, really beautiful quote that I just want to read. He says, "We dread nothing but slavery, we fear not death. That gloomy night, the pale-faced moon, and the frightened stars that hurry through the sky can witness that we fear not death. Our hearts which, at the recollection, glow with rage that 4 revolving years have scarcely taught us to restrain, can witness that we fear not death." And through this, on top of, the diction and the syntax, you can see the technique of repetition, which really instills into his audience that we only fear slavery. Obviously, we don't fear death. And that continues on with this idea that they will have to stand up for their rights, which is what they have done in the past and what they continue to do throughout history with boycotting and protesting. And that's something that really kind of puts the fire in the soul throughout the next years of they don't want to be slaves to Britain. He also talks about the men who were killed in the Boston Massacre, kind of calling them out and then speaking directly to the British, which not only humanizes the men who were killed and kind of puts it in the audience, these were real people and they were important. And if the audience was related to them, it kind of brings them back to what actually happened. But also, when he talks about saying, "Do not the injured shades of these men attend you in your solitary walks, arrest you even in the midst of your debaucheries, and fill even your dreams with terror," which is kind of a really chilling image because he's just so angry about everything that happened. And again, that is something else that becomes reflected into his audience. So Hancock using slavery as kind of a metaphor for their situation was really common at the time. And again, this can be seen in Henry's work in the famous lines, "Give me liberty or give me death." But besides that, you can see also how Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal," because they didn't want to be seen or feel like slaves because of the lack of representation of the common people in their government. And these rich white men at the time who owned slaves calling themselves slaves is pretty ironic because in actuality they had so much more freedom than anyone else in the colonies as wealthy landowning men who could vote when comparing to women or minorities such as not only enslaved people, but also free African Americans, and then also how they treated the Native Americans at the time or lower class people who couldn't vote. So that's very ironic how they did that, but it is something that was very commonly used at the time. Next, Hancock kind of transitions into his true purpose, which when he says, "Let our misfortunes teach posterity to guard against such evils for the future," he talks about defending America more and forming a militia. But before just cutting in and saying, we need a militia, remember at the time these colonists had to quarter troops in their home. So they were kind of very anti-standing armies. So before he goes in just talking about how we need a militia, he makes sure to differentiate between the troops from Britain and the honorable militia, well-disciplined militia who would help the community because they are doing it for the betterment of their community and their state, which he makes sure to say this is not what Britain was doing. They are not honorable. They do not have as much morality, but our militia would. And then for similarities to other works, you can see this in John Adams' letter to his wife, where there was an unfortunate situation in his town, and he kind of took that situation to learn about more in the future when he says, "But let us take warning and give it to our children." He uses his people in his town situation to kind of pass it on, and that's what Hancock was saying as well. So now Hancock has this idea of the militia in his audience's head, and he takes it a step further to be like, well, remember your ancestors and remember why they came here, and you don't want it to, as he says, suffer this country to be a den of thieves, kind of playing with their pride and saying, well, you don't want this, kind of place that was formed for freedom to come down and just be a place where the British can come in and impose their rights and do whatever they want. And then again, getting at their pride when he talks about how the men there are superior, that and the sufferings an enraged tyrant can inflict will never take away, because Americans, they came here to be better and they are better. So he is using that to kind of push more of the militia into their minds. And then he talks again about having the most animating confidence for how this will turn out, and then finally talking about God and again giving that religious purpose to what they're doing. And something really important to notice is his word choice of enraged tyrant and needing salvation. He's talking about Britain and using these really strong words. Most people think of salvation with heaven and hell, but him claiming that he needs salvation from British and they need salvation from Great Britain make it again into kind of really big thing that is instilled in their audience later on. And this boost of confidence, saying, I have the most confidence that this will work out, again, working with their pride, is also done by pain and common sense. And then obviously using God and Christianity was a big, big thing in this era. But something that can be seen from a little further back was when Winthrop was explicitly connecting their success with God. When he was talking to the Puritans coming to America, how God is on their side if they have this salvation or if they create this new world. And Hancock is kind of saying the same thing, how God is on our side for this. And so for the legacy of John Hancock, he was later elected as a delegate for the Second Continental Congress and had his voice heard in the Revolution. He was a big reason for the Boston Tea Party, for a lot of the protests, obviously signing of the Declaration of Independence. And what's really important about this piece is that it showed how people at the time felt about Britain and what techniques were used to convince others to push for their rights back, to push for a militia, and later to push for a revolution when people really wanted that, and how powerful their rhetoric became, and how this was a big factor when urging people to push for independence because it was so forceful. And through this, you can also see not just how Hancock felt, but how the colonists and the people of America felt at the time about Britain, about defending themselves, about protesting and boycotting, and what were the reasons that led up to their final push for independence later on against one of the world's most powerful countries, and also how they won, and how by their legacy, what they did to cause so many other countries of oppressed peoples at the time to fight for their own freedom. And finally, for significance, there were so many parts of the speech that are still important to this day, and it was a very beautiful and well-crafted speech. It reminded the Americans of what happened, and it uses pathos, hyperbole, repetition, ethos, allusion, and so many other rhetorical techniques to kind of get them in the early revolution-oriented mindset. It made them angry and upset, and they wanted to be treated better by Great Britain at this time. And because of this, it really gave the colonists a reason to want independence in the long run from Britain. It was one of the earlier pieces that kind of subliminally promoted the idea of revolution, but more than that, it just kind of built up to the revolution, starting with the formation of a militia and that push for not letting Britain walk all over them. And so, yeah, this piece was really amazing to look at, and to this day has a lot of historical significance from what it did to the formation of the current United States through the rhetorical values, through the rhetorical aspects, and through the historical knowledge. We were able to kind of create this presentation and present it to you guys. So thank you so much for watching. It has been really great. And yeah.